So welcome to this month's Research Notes webinar. I want to start by acknowledging country. I'm here on Yawuru country over here in the West Kimberley, but I also wanted to acknowledge Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples in Canberra, where I think many of you are at the moment, and pay my respect to elders past and present, whoever country you are on today. So in the place we call Australia, sovereignty of land has never been ceded, but neither has sovereignty of water. And that may come into our discussion of water justice today as part of this Research Notes webinar, which is hosted by the Resources, Environment and Development Group from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. As you can see on my Zoom, I am Kat Taylor. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Water Justice Hub, and today we have Professor Quentin Grafton as our guest speaker. He is a professor of economics and also an Australian Laureate Research Fellow. He's also the convener of the Water Justice Hub. Quentin is the director for the Centre of Water Economics, Environment and Policy, and he was also in 2010 appointed the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Water Economics and Transboundary Water Governance. Quentin has an extensive background in water, and I am delighted to welcome him to today's seminar, which is all about water justice. Quentin, if I could invite you to begin.
Thanks so much, Kat, and thank you for acknowledgement to country. And I also want to acknowledge the country that I'm standing on right now, which is Ngunnawal Ngambri land that was never ceded. I also want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I've got about 20 minutes, so Kat tells me to talk about bending towards water justice. So I've only got a few slides. I'm going to highlight essentially work that has taken place over 18 months now. I think it's getting on to 2 years because of COVID-19. It's a special issue in the International Journal of Water Resources and Development. And that special issue was about getting together a series of contributions from around the world, although we perhaps weren't as successful as we wanted to be in terms of the spatial coverage, that would look at the issues of social justice from a water perspective. So let me just take you through what I'm wanting to talk to you about in the context of bending towards, because that's a term that I think quite a number of you are familiar with, and it was popularized most recently by President Barack Obama during his presidency, but he took it from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a very famous speech he gave in Washington, D.C. in 1968. And I'm going to raise that issue to start off with, and we can come back to it in the discussion. I don't have an answer for you. I'm just going to pose some questions and we'll talk it through. So what you see here are three statements which around the statement that was popularized by President Obama, but its origin, as far as I was able to determine, comes from an abolitionist minister in the United States. Of course, this is before the Civil War. And this is what he says. So you read it. I don't want to read it for you. If you can, I presume you can all read it. It's just highlighting this issue of what we mean by bending towards justice. And he has a moral component, spiritual, emotional, whatever you want to describe it. I don't want to ascribe any particular interpretations to it, except he does make it very clear it's about bending towards justice. And he was talking in the context of the anti-slavery movement. So it was very clear in that context. And then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had this statement that in that very famous speech that he gave, several famous speeches, but I'll read his words because I think that's the one where a lot of people focus in on. We shall overcome, and if you recall that speech, it's very, very well known. We shall overcome. Of course, it's based on an anthem, so to speak, in terms of we shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So this idea that somehow or other we are going to move in a direction towards justice, and of course he was talking in the context of civil rights in the United States, which is very much focused on the issue of social and economic injustice for the African American people of the United States of America. And then here's the last comment, which again sort of has its own interpretation of this notion of a bending towards justice. And this is from Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General during the period of Barack Obama, President Obama. And so I just want to highlight what he says here. Again, I will read it out because it's somewhat different to Dr. Martin Luther King. The arc bends towards justice, but it only bends towards justice because people pull it towards justice. It doesn't happen on its own. And I'm highlighting these words simply because this gets to this issue of what we should be doing. And I'm not offering it, I'm not preaching here. I'm just simply saying what we should be thinking about doing in the context of our own work. And it depends where we are in our work as researchers. It depends what we do in terms of our teaching, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to put this up as a sort of a controversial beginning in the sense that, you know, is it about outputs as researchers, or is it about outcomes? And I think it's both, but I wanted to do that juxtaposition, outputs versus outcomes, because if it's outcomes that we're about, then perhaps we need to be doing our own work in the context of bending towards justice. So that's the preface, so to speak, of where we're going. And I'm now going to bring this down from the big picture in terms of civil rights from '68 and from anti-slavery from the 19th century and from economic justice from the United States during the presidency of Barack Obama to this issue of water justice. And I've highlighted at the very beginning, we have a special issue that's going to come out shortly. We have several papers or contributions that have already been published and already accessible, and I'll go through some of those in a little bit of detail. And there are several papers that have been provisionally accepted, but in terms of final acceptance, that comes from the editor-in-chief, and I'm not the editor-in-chief. I'm simply one of 3 editors who were guest editors for the special issue. So in terms of the outline of where we're going in the next few minutes is just, I want to highlight 7 key questions that we asked the contributors to respond to. Some were very willing to answer those questions, and some were less willing. It sort of intervened with their writing style. However, I was very dogmatic in insisting that they do answer those questions, and they have all done so in their own way. So there's a series of papers that I'll quickly talk through. I might ask Anna to quickly talk to her paper for a minute or less, because Ana Manero is the lead author on the perceptions of Tanzanian smallholder irrigators, and we'll go through, and then I'll highlight some of the papers that have been provisionally accepted as well. So we'll see where we end up. So what we sought to do in this special issue was to amplify voice, so to give voice to those suffering from water injustice. And we had a particular process of trying to do that in terms of engaging people from a wide area and also communities. I have to say that I don't think we were successful in that, but we tried our best, and our best wasn't good enough. But that certainly was a key factor for us. There I have a series of researchers who've contributed to the special issue and have or about to be published who have given voice and have included people from those communities. Promote truth, what's going on in relation to injustice and impediments to water justice. We were trying to seek some sort of reconciliation, thinking about, people talk about it as solutions, but maybe that's too strong a word, maybe meaningful pathways. This is a process, it's a journey that doesn't have an end in some sense. And of course, inclusion, trying to include a variety of diversity of views in the context of water justice. And again, I'm not sure we've succeeded in all of those, but that was certainly what we tried to do. And we certainly did our best, given the difficult situation of doing a special issue and during a global pandemic. So we asked the contributors right from the beginning, so this didn't get landed on them on the second or third revision. So we asked them from the very beginning to answer all of these questions. And of course, they've answered the questions in very different ways, depending on what they've actually contributed. They're from different locations in the world, different communities they're looking at, different aspects of water justice. So just highlight that the sort of basic questions that we do need to ask ourselves when we focus on the issue of justice, broadly speaking, and certainly in the context of this special issue of water justice, is for whom? So who are we talking about? Okay, so we're putting boundaries in some sense around the people affected, and it is anthropocentric, so it is focused on people and their places. To what? So is it access, availability? I mean, what are the sets of issues here? They're not mutually exclusive. The where and on what scale. So typically it's been at quite a relatively small scale, although we do have a paper that encompasses all of Australia. The when, obviously the past lands on us in the present and continues into the future. So, but we wanted to get some sense of temporal scale of when are we talking about. The why. So this is the sort of one of the harder questions is, well, what's generating this injustice? And there's all sorts of reasons for that, historical, etc. And then the how. How do we mitigate the injustice, which is the pathways, solutions, I suppose, and that feeds into the actions. So this is about the what's going to happen. Okay, what are we going to do? And in no sense did we suggest that the researchers should be undertaking all of those actions, but we did ask all of our researchers and contributors to focus in on the sorts of actions that might be required. So at least to document that, even if they weren't doing that themselves. So I'm going to go through just very briefly some of the papers that have already been published. So they're certainly accessible on the website. Some of them are going to be open access for whatever reason in the process. This paper is going to be open access. It isn't at the moment. The intent was, but it just never happened that way. So we're in the process of fixing that. So this gives you some idea. This is although I'm the editor, you can see my name as a contributor. So that caused an issue about how you respond to that as an editor if you are a contributor. So I had two other editors, and so one of the other editors managed the entire process. So I was completely excluded from it. So that was the benefit of having multiple editors. So that was, and we certainly weren't given an easy review, and we got some very good comments as we went through. So there's an Australia focus in the papers that are already published, but you'll see towards the end I'll also present a range of papers that come from other parts of the world. They've gone through perhaps a longer process in terms of trying to get to the final endpoint of publication. So it's really about Indigenous land. We gave the acknowledgement of country, Kat and I did. We focused here in terms of the Northern Territory, and this has been, at least initially, was viewed by some as a very important development, which was the strategic Aboriginal water reserve. We had some connection to that from more than a decade ago, William and I, in terms of work that was done up in the NT. And anyway, the legislation has now passed. It hasn't been put into regulation, but it has in fact been passed. And it has a whole set of issues around what does that mean in terms of water access for non-Indigenous, and what protections are provided for Indigenous people. And there is a reserve up to 30% as a maximum in some locations. In fact, only a few locations in the Northern Territory. And that reserve is now in place. As I said, the regulations have yet to be implemented, and that requires some connection to the federal government in addition to the territorial government. So we go through that. We talk about where this idea came from, the notion behind it, how in some sense it got moved into another dimension in the sense of how the legislation was implemented, what is the legislation, what was the response, and what were the submissions by the Northern and Central Land Councils. They had a process that they wanted to be followed that wasn't followed. They had a number of requirements that they wanted to happen but did not happen. And so in the end, we make that comparison between law, which is the Strategic Aboriginal Water Reserve, and justice. And justice has not been delivered in the context of water in the NT. I wish it had been with that law, but it hasn't been. And indeed, right now, there's a set of issues associated around Tennant Creek and the Singleton property, which is asking for some very large amounts of groundwater for free, which I think will have a big implication on the traditional owners in that location. So that's in the Northern Territory as we speak right now. So there's a whole set of issues that need to be responded to, and we've just looked at the law versus justice. I'm going to ask Anna if she wants to step in. I don't want to talk to Anna's work, but so if Anna's there, please unmute yourself and give us a brief summary of that if you want. If not,
hi, Quentin.
Yes.
I'm here.
Yeah, do you want to briefly talk to your work and its relevant?
I'll just briefly talk to my work. And one of the key questions in the paper that I worked on with Professor Sarah Wheeler was equity or inequity of what? And this is departing from a big question posed by economists and in a couple of decades ago when asking about economic inequality, but inequality of what? So we pose the same question is, what are equity, but what are equity of what? And we looked at the literature that has been developed in this space in the context of irrigation, particularly in developing countries where a large proportion of the population depends on agriculture and irrigation for food security and livelihoods. And we found there's a very strong body of literature linking good or reliable water access and crop yields, but we took a step further and looked at those other variables. They're not easily quantifiable, but they're still very important. And by developing like a qualitative research, we uncovered certain critical mechanisms whereby water inequity influences socioeconomic inequalities. And through the stories that farmers were telling us, we heard things like farmers say, well, I have enough water, but it's not about how much, it's about when I get it. I spend hours and hours roaming around my farm, and I could spend that time working somewhere else. A female farmer told us that she had enough water, but her turn to irrigate was at night, and that posed serious problems for her of getting assaulted, walking back and forth to her farm at night. So we uncovered very critical, important pathways whereby water equity can either be a catalysis for greater social equity or vice versa. It could amplify social inequities that go beyond the mere quantities of crops produced. So if you want, I'll hand back to Quentin, but if you want to know more, please, by all means, get in touch and I can send you a copy of the paper. We could just have a chat. Thank you, Quentin.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for this the nice summary. So yes, this is one of the published papers, so it's certainly accessible and you get it directly from Anna or from the journal itself. There's a paper that builds on the work that Lana Hartwick has done in relation to water entitlements, water rights for First Peoples in Australia. This focus of where there is in terms of New South Wales, and it provides an historical framing about how we've ended up where we are in 2021, and very much focuses on the colonial and neo-colonial legacies associated with why First Peoples have been dispossessed of water in New South Wales and indeed in most locations of Australia. So one of the key people of our Water Justice Hub is Virginia Marshall. She's the inaugural postdoctoral Indigenous scholar here at the ANU. And she wrote a book called Aqua Nullius. Obviously, it's about lack of water rights in the context of First Peoples of Australia. So this is a very nice review, overview of what's going on and where we got to where we are. Yeah, we do have three papers that has an Australia focus, and this is the third paper, and this was also just published as well, and looks again from a particular circumstance in the context of lack of water, Although there were land rights associated here, there wasn't initially water rights, and how that was delivered and what that might mean going forward. So the going forward is the potential for providing water entitlements rights for other First Peoples in the context of they're lacking those rights, even though they have existing land rights. So there's a lot of First Peoples in that situation. Barkantji, for example, in the lower Barker Darling would be one of those First Nations that don't have those water rights, but they do have substantial land rights. Okay, so and then the last paper that's being published, although there are other papers to be published, focuses on Cape Town, South Africa. It's a very large township. If you ever get to Cape Town, you travel from the airport. It's they call them townships, but it's a city, and does include many informal settlements as part of that, and they have lacked water justice. And this looks at the historical roots. The why is of course apartheid policies in South Africa, although that is long past. It still has a legacy. And then how to respond to that in the context of decisions that are made at a city level in Cape Town. And so one of those issues is about justice, is of course about voice. And they talk about the importance of community voices, because how the city's going to know what particular communities want. Communities have to be listened to. They need to have that voice and a respected seat at the table, so to speak, to be able to get the outcomes that the communities need. So it's a nice, and there's about a dozen authors on this. So there were community activists associated with it, as well as researchers as well from Europe and South Africa. So then these are the papers that have been provisionally accepted by the guest editors, all three of us. They haven't been published yet. So what happens, we accept them in a provisional sense and send all the material to the editor-in-chief, and the editor-in-chief then makes the call. And it's a bit of a black box when they finally come out. But you can, I don't know whether Keith's on the line, but are you there, Keith? Okay, well, Keith Barney is one of the authors of those papers. That's from Lowell. We've got papers there in the context of, this is a different paper, this is a different title here. This is about, not Cape Town, this is about Europe. In the context of a community system that's in place about responding to privatization in Europe. We've got issues associated with the water access for Muslim households with a gender perspective. And then another paper that looks from a community perspective in Colombia. And so we did our best to bring in different community perspectives wherever we could. And we've landed up with perhaps not what we would have wanted, but nevertheless, we do have some diversity as well as spatial diversity in the context of the various responses to those 7 questions we established. And we will have the special issue launched probably in the next couple of months as these papers come out, and we'll have an editorial associated with that. So you get a sense of what this all means and what the overall perspective is. So I'll close it down at this point. I'm happy to answer questions as best that I can. And then perhaps if we wanted to, we can talk about this issue of history bending towards justice or not, and what that means for us as researchers. So thank you, Kat.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Quentin, for that presentation.